After more than 500 people were arrested in central London at the weekend for marching in support of the proscribed terrorist organisation Palestine Action, we will ask if the protests will stop the arrests, or whether the arrests will stop the protests. That's on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. First of all, my colleague Dominic Casciani, our Home and Legal Affairs correspondent, has written a really interesting piece on the BBC News website about Palestine Action. That is that direct action group that a few weeks ago was proscribed as a terrorist organisation. The result being that they seem to have a growing number of supporters who are going out and protesting in favour of the organisation, which means the police are having to arrest them in huge numbers. And we've also learned a little bit more as a result of all of this about how the government reached the decision to prescribe them in the first place. So you know what I like to do? If I read something interesting on our website, I like to then get the person who's written it on the podcast so we can all brainstorm it. So Dominic Casciani is here. Hello, Dom.
Hello. Hi. How are you doing, Adam?
Very well, thank you. I want to dig into the piece that you've written for the website in a second.
Yeah.
It's super interesting, but I think we just need to do a bit of background first of all, and just talk us through the timeline that led to Palestine Action being proscribed as a terrorist organisation in the first place. Yeah.
So this has been actually quite a protracted history, and anybody who's been following it in recent weeks, they could be forgiven for actually forming the view that this is something that's just suddenly happened overnight when Palestine Action, basically some of its supporters allegedly broke into RAF Bryce Norton, military base, and spray painted 2 RAF jets, which caused the trial of those individuals will hear an alleged £7 million worth of damage. And then very quickly after that, the Home Secretary said, we're banning this group under terrorism legislation. And everyone went, what? What's going on here? In actual fact, that decision to prescribe, to use the legal jargon, Palestine Action actually dates back more than that, about 8 months, really. It all dates back to growing police concerns about some of the group's activities and whether or not police actually had the powers to contain it and stop its members from breaking the law. So going back a few years, Palestine Action was basically born out of the broad movement around Gaza and the West Bank and all those kind of things. And when it was set up, it directly effectively marketed itself as a direct action group. Now, what I mean by that, Adam, is that it wanted to stage events which were provocative and were pushing effectively at the outer edges of protest law, on the basis that sometimes extreme events elsewhere in the world, and in their view, presently, effectively what they say is genocide in Gaza, require effectively the public have the legitimate right to take extreme measures to protest against them. And the obvious example from our own history, of course, is the suffragettes and some of the activity the suffragettes got up to a century ago to force Parliament to give women the vote. So it's very much part of that kind of tradition. And it began staging effectively sit-ins, occupations, minor acts of vandalism, usually involving red paint being sprayed, on firms that Palestine Action said were involved in funding the Israeli Defense Forces, or supplying the Israeli Defense Forces. So a range of firms, military firms, financial institutions, things like this. So in August 2024, a group of alleged Palestine Action supporters broke into Elbit Systems in Bristol. So that's an Israeli defense firm that's long been a key target. And they used a repurposed prison van to smash through a security fence. They got access to a warehouse and used crowbars and other tools to smash up equipment. And the group was very public about this. They promoted this. Now, along the way, 3 people were injured, a security guard and 2 police officers. And an awful lot of people have now been charged with offences in relation to that, which broadly break down into criminal damage, assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, violent disorder, aggravated burglary. Now, there's a series of linked trials. The individuals there deny wrongdoing in those particular cases, and that's for a jury to deal with at a later date. But the key point, I think, is, Adam, is this. It's at that point, effectively a year ago, that security officials and government and the police started thinking seriously, should we try to ban this group under terrorism legislation? Because we keep prosecuting people, and there have been about 600 arrests of Palestine Action supporters over the 4 years since it was formed. But these actions kept happening, and they kept causing criminal damage, which the police now estimate, and this is in court documents, to run into hundreds of millions of pounds. So the police and the Home Office began thinking, is there a legal case to ban this group? Now, the interesting thing about that is that there's lots of reports that Israel and the defence firms themselves have lobbied the UK about Palestine Action. There's been no comment from the firm themselves about their involvement in this down the years and whether they've had any involvement at all. But the key thing is, prior to 2024, the government had concluded there was no case to ban the group. That event at Elbit and a number of similar incidents started to convince officials that they crossed the threshold for terrorism.
And so that's why Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, feels justified in saying, if you think Palestine Action is a non-violent direct action group, you are wrong.
That's right. And that's because, Adam, whilst most people think about terrorism in terms of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State or the extreme far right, people who are turning to extreme forms of violence on the streets, our definition of terrorism also includes using serious criminal damage to exert influence and try to advance a cause. Now, you might wonder why that is the case, and it's a complete outlier compared to lots of other countries, but it's because of the experience of the UK and the IRA. There were times during the IRA's campaign when it decided it didn't actually want to take lives, or effectively that's how it marketed it. I'll leave others to judge whether that's true or not. But the point was, it was focused on economic damage. They deliberately set bombs in Belfast to blow things up, whilst also ringing in a call to try to avoid people being harmed. And anyone who was in London in the 1990s will remember the IRA targeting the City of London, enormous attacks, Canary Wharf, in which they weren't, in their view, trying to take lives. They were trying to basically harm the economy. So when the modern terrorism legislation was drafted and became law 25 years ago, Tony Blair's government made sure that the definition included serious criminal damage. And that's been dormant for years, but now it's been triggered because of Palestine Action. And security officials said, we can use this justifiably to ban this group. And that gives the police and MI5 alongside them, if necessary, more powers to intrude into this group and actually cut them off before they actually carry out action, which is causing enormous economic damage.
And Dom, your online piece is built around this idea that there are 3 court cases that would be quite definitive for this whole thing. What happened at Elbit or didn't happen at Elbit that you're talking about there is one of them. One of the others is what happens to the people who went to protest in favour of Palestine Action in Parliament Square on Saturday. Hundreds and hundreds of them.
That's right, Adam. So if we go through these in order, if you think about the Elbit case is really important for the Home Secretary because of our criminal justice rules. We can't effectively go into the evidence in that case and what specifically the evidence is against each of the individuals who took part in their precise relationship, if any, to Palestine Action. That's for the court case to hear and the jury to decide. But when that happens, which will begin in November, we'll start to see that evidence and the defences, and then we'll have a better sense of what was going on there. So that's very important for the Home Secretary because she believes that helps to make her case. The arrests, now this is extraordinary what's going on there. We had 522 people arrested on Saturday who held up signs saying, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action. More than 200 others in previous weeks have been arrested for holding up the same signs. Now, the 700 or so who've been arrested, only 3 of them have been charged so far. And they've been charged with a relatively minor terrorism legislation offence of effectively displaying an article supportive of a banned terror group. And that's a crime which has existed ever since the days of Northern Ireland to stop paramilitaries coming out onto the streets with uniforms, those kind of things. But the sign saying, I support Palestine Action, were deemed to, so far, be sufficient for an arrest. Now, if the government charges all of those people, and that's actually going to be quite a tough thing to do because each of those files potentially has to be signed off right at the top by the Director of Public Prosecutions and potentially the Attorney General for effectively safeguarding and oversight. All of those cases are going to potentially take years to go through the courts because protesters in those situations are going to say, hang on a second, I'm not a terrorist. I'm exercising my right to free speech, demonstrating against the prescription of a group where I believe they have a legitimate right to be involved in direct action in the name of stopping genocide. That's effectively what their defense is going to be. And critically, none of those cases can realistically get underway because of the third element of stuff which is going on in the courts, and that's the challenge to the banning order by one of Palestine Action's co-founders, a woman called Huda Amori. She's got a big challenge against the Home Secretary. That's not taking place until November. If she were to win her case, you've got to then realize that the 700 people being arrested, well, I mean, how can they be prosecuted if the group is no longer a banned terrorist organization? So you've got these three interlocking things going on here, which makes it a very, very, very tense situation. And while all that's going along, the people who are opposing the prescription and are trying to organize a campaign, they're saying they're going to come back out onto the streets in a couple of weeks' time. And they're trying to get, well, in their view, they say we want to get 1,000 people out. But I mean, whether they'll do that, we'll have to wait and see.
And just explain why some people are referring to that as an I am Spartacus moment.
Yeah. Okay. So do you want me to talk about the film?
Yeah.
Actually explain where this
for
comes
those
from,
of us
origin,
who, I mean, I've seen it. I know. I was just using this as an opportunity for you to explain it in political legal terms.
Yeah. So Spartacus, if you think about the really famous film, when was it? Was it the 50s or 60s? I can't quite remember now, but it's Kirk Douglas, and he plays the leader of the slave rebellion in the Roman Empire, Spartacus. And at the end of the film, they've lost their final battle and they're all in chains. And the Roman generals are saying, right, we'll spare all your lives if you hand over Spartacus. And then one individual slave stands up and says, I am Spartacus. And of course, he isn't Spartacus. And then another slave stands up and goes, no, I am Spartacus. And then literally 10,000 men stand up all saying, I am Spartacus. And there's a very weepy scene where Spartacus himself realizes that all these men are going to sacrifice their lives in order to die alongside him. And Shami Chakrabarti has used that analogy, the Labour peer and former civil liberties leader. And Shami Chakrabarti said the government could be heading for an I am Spartacus moment where people are trying to overwhelm the Home Office and the police with basically volunteering that they are supporting Palestine Action in order to effectively try and make the whole thing become unworkable. Because if there are 700 prosecutions, then maybe another 1,000 on top, speculating there. Can the system cope with that? Now, I think that's a really, really interesting position, and I'm not sure how far that will run, because there is a general sort of there's a general approach in policing, which is you bite off as much as you can and you get there slowly. And if it's going to take us longer, we will still get there. We will arrest, we will prosecute, we will get people convicted if necessary. And it will then become a question of whether the police have got the resources, and counter-terrorism policing do have an awful lot of resources, and whether there's political will to continue. I think the political will thing could become more complicated in light of what may come out in the High Court about the legal challenge. But also because of pressure elsewhere. If you start to see parts of the Labour Party wobbling over this because they feel this is an infringement on free speech. So it could become very, very complicated. But I think I don't want to speculate too much about that, because obviously from the perspective of the protesters, it's obviously in their interest to suggest they're winning this. And it's obviously in the interest of the government to say, we're going to carry on, we're going to plod along, and there'll be arrests and all the rest of it. But I think it's it's far too early to see how this will pan out. It'll fundamentally come down to these three interlocking court cases and how they're dealt with by juries and by judges.
And it's interesting because that whole I am Spartacus approach, that feels more like kind of the civil rights struggle in America in 1965 rather than how politics and the law is done in Britain in 2025, actually.
It does indeed. I mean, look, we've had a recent sort of similar attempt of this with the Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion climate change movements, where there have been attempts to get sufficient number of people onto the streets, taking part in highly disruptive and sometimes arguably criminal events to disrupt traffic and effectively grind, in particular, London to a halt. And those incidents have been an attempt to try and force the issue around climate change and government. Now, they've all petered out, and they petered out for two reasons. The first is that government just kept going with various legal techniques to try and contain and curtail the protests, where the protests they felt had gone beyond the realms of legitimate free speech. So, for instance, there have been an awful lot of prosecutions of people sitting in the M25, things like that, okay? And then ultimately what happened is those movements started to run out of people who were prepared to take on the risk of arrest, conviction, and potential jailing as well. And I think government is banking on the same thing again. The interesting thing is a lot of the people who are involved in that movement have actually got involved in the Palestine Action movement. There is no surprise that an awful lot of the people who have been arrested so far are over 50 years old, and an awful lot of people, awful lot of them, are retired. It's because they've been involved in the climate change movement, thinking we're so concerned about that, we're willing to risk arrest because we've got nothing to lose. We've got our pensions. We're retired. We're looking after the roses in the garden or whatever. Let's go out and actually do something that young people aren't in the position to do because it could ruin their careers.
Dom, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. And would you like to just remind people about your excellent documentary on BBC Sounds that's around at the moment?
Thank you, Adam. That's very kind. So I've done a 3-part series called State of Terror, which charts how the UK state has responded to terrorism since the 7/7 attacks in 2005. I'm enormously indebted to all the people who took part in it, actually people who went through some appalling things in their lives, from police officers to survivors of terrorism, and also actually one young man who became a terrorist offender himself and then volunteered to speak to me about it, having seen the light and changed his ways. And I think their stories together hopefully make people think about the journey that the country's been on to try and become safer, and how it's not simple. And government doesn't always get it right. But fundamentally, if they don't try, well, the consequences would be awful for all of us.
Dominic, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've had some big economic news today. It was, how much did the economy grow by in the second quarter of 2025? So here to unpick it is BBC Economics Deputy Editor, Dharshini David. Hello.
Hello, Adam.
And Alex Forsyth is back. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Adam.
Down at Westminster, or across at Westminster.
Across.
Or, I mean, in podcasting, there is no geography, is there?
No, I'm just in Westminster.
Everyone's just
How's
here.
That? We're all just present.
Dharshini, how much bigger is the economy now?
How much bigger is the economy? Bigger, which in itself is causing sighs of reliefs at the Treasury. I was about to say down in the Treasury, it's not down or up, as we were just saying, in the Treasury, because there were fears that we could see the economy near stagnating in the last 3 months. In actual fact, that did not happen. It has performed better than we thought. And the government has actually been saying, look, if you look across the first half of this year, we are amongst the best performing of the major economies. Having said that, we have lost momentum over the course of this year. We are more resilient than people thought. But on the other hand, things aren't quite as perky as many would like it to be.
So the quarterly GDP growth is 0.3%.
It is, yes, 0.3%. And if you look at what happened there, we had May and April were a little bit of a washout. If you look at June, that's where things really perked up. And that is why we've got this better than expected number. And that is why you've got some economists now sort of saying, we're going to edge up our forecast just a little bit for growth this year, which doesn't get the Chancellor out the hole she faces in terms of the public finances, doesn't give you that much more money. Nevertheless, prospects are a bit brighter. And crucially, when you look at those key sectors like manufacturing and construction, and in fact, most of services, they are more resilient than people thought, even though many of those companies that are in those sectors are facing these bigger bills.
And did we get any more clues from the Office for National Statistics, who provide the data, the headline number, about what was going on with the economy?
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, there's plenty. How much detail would you possibly like?
Loads.
There's a whole website of it. There's spreadsheets. We get lost for days and that stuff. But there is more detail, and not all of it is the kind of thing that they want to read in the Treasury, because on the face of it, things are looking better. If you do things like, for example, you take into account population growth, GDP per quarter, as we like to look at it, per person has only increased by 0.2%, which isn't that great. Now, the Chancellor has said since she came into office, the economy's grown by 1.2%. In a per person basis, 0.9%. It is growth, but it's not the kind of growth people were used to, say, prior to the financial crisis. So we've got a long way to go to get back to the kind of growth the government wants to see. It's a hopeful thing. And if you look at the detail as well, retail, for example, had a bad quarter. And that really matters. This is a sector that has been hit by those higher bills in particular, from national insurance, higher minimum wages. They've been laying off staff. On top of that, they now seem to be faced with cautious consumers, because consumer spending hasn't increased by that much, which was quite surprising given that incomes are rising quite robustly. But it looks like people are holding back. Why are they holding back? Perhaps because they're concerned about what lies ahead for the jobs market, for the budget as well. And it's those kind of factors which may hold back growth in the coming months too. In
the next quarter. Alex, how is this all being perceived down at, across at, up at Westminster?
In the Treasury, exactly as Dharshini said, I think there's definitely a bit of a sense of relief at these figures because they are better than were expected. But you can't get away from the fact that growth is still pretty sluggish across the board. And you've got to cast your mind back to what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer were saying even before they went into office, which was they were kind of banking on growth as their answer to a lot of the things that they wanted to do and how they fund them. You know, if we get the economy moving and growing, then we'll be able to fund public services in the way that we want. But despite these better than expected growth figures, they are still left with the conundrum they were left with before, which is what are they going to do with the budget? And I fear, Adam, we're going to enter into this territory where we are speculating pre-budget all the way from now up until November. So I'm kind of cautious of doing that. But on the day when these figures come out, it clearly does pose the question, how are they going to manage the public finances? Because this rate of growth, albeit better, is not enough to avoid some of the choices they're going to have to make at the budget, particularly potentially around tax.
And Dharshini, before me and Alex indulge in some pre-budget speculation, which we just sort of complained about, but we'll now, if you can't beat them, join them.
No, we do it every year. So let's not pretend we
it's
don't
why we
do
have
it.
podcasts
Yes.
And the news. It's not just podcasts, other mediums do it too. I mean, it's interesting. We were talking about this in one of our Edinburgh shows last week. When it was NISA, one of the think tanks, come out with their estimate of what the black hole that Rachel Reeves will have to deal with at the next budget actually is. I mean, we're going to hear all sorts of different takes on the size of the gap that she's going to have to make up. What's some sort of rules of thumb or some things to bear in mind over the next few months as we hear all these things? Oh, Rachel Reeves is going to have to hike up taxes by 25 billion, or maybe 47 billion, or 52.13 billion.
Well, look, it's a bit like you were just saying about the pre-budget speculation. That's what economists do. That's what we do. We just bandy around these big numbers, like, oh, it could be this, it could be that. And we'll hear a lot more of that. But the thing to hang on to in all of this is that it doesn't matter what they think. It matters what the Office of Budget Responsibility think on the day itself. They are the ones making the forecast. Small changes in their assumptions about growth, about inflation, about interest rates move the dial quite a bit when it comes to how much money she has to find to meet the fiscal rules. It's interesting that you mentioned NISA. Now, NISA have also come out today and said, OK, because we know that we had a good end to the second quarter, a good June, we now think the economy could grow by 0.5% in the third quarter. And one of my colleagues, who shall remain nameless, said, hang on, this is a bit like the Waldorf and Statler sketch in the Muppet Show. Remember this? It's better. No, it's worse. No, it's better. No, it's worse. And the evidence is going to change like this month on month. And you're going to see some people changing their estimates for that black hole as well. And that means, of course, the speculation will change because what kind of measures you need to do to find money will change too.
In other words, you can't just take the last quarter's GDP growth figure, put it into some kind of algorithm, and then get a number at the end that says, oh, this is how much Rachel Reeves will have to either put up taxes, borrow more, or spend less as a result.
No, because the rules are all about the future, and it's forecasts that matter, not the past.
That's a very, very wise bit of advice. Alex, right, the speculation, I mean, we've seen one classic example of it this week, haven't we? Reports in all the newspapers yesterday and some the day before that Rachel Reeves is planning to change the rules on inheritance tax and how much you can pass on to your beneficiaries as gifts tax-free before you die.
Yeah. And I think just really briefly back to that point, I think because the data is going to change and because the predictions are going to change and because the speculation is going to change, when all of these ideas start floating around about what the Chancellor may or may not do, you are going to hear one really consistent line from Rachel Reeves, and it's the one that she said today, which is the forecast that matters is the OBRs, and when that comes, then we will set our budget in the usual way. It's almost like the kind of changes in all of the analysis around this allow the Chancellor to make that argument that they're going to wait for the forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility before they go ahead and set their budget. So they're not going to confirm or deny anything, and that's what they did around these inheritance tax proposals that were floated in the papers. But I think what is quite interesting is, just a little bit of an insight into the way this stuff works. Some of this stuff around that we will inevitably see a lot of between now and the budget in November. Some of this stuff might come from, like whispers around government, people discussing things in Westminster, MPs chatting away, where might the Chancellor look? And we know there's been quite a lot of chat within the Labour Party about the possibility of taxing wealth in some way. So it might not be surprising if we hear a bit of that. Some other stuff comes from ideas that are kind of gently floated out there into the ether from some people around government to see how they land. The official kind of jargon is like kite flying, so that, you let an idea seep out into the papers and get a sense of the reaction. And then that might inform some of the kind of processes around government about where they land ahead of the budget. So that I think we're going to see quite a lot of that between now and November, because whatever the estimated size of the gap is by the time we get to that point, I think most people accept there is going to be a gap, and that tax is going to be, because the Chancellor has made the choices that she has around spending, because we know there's been quite a lot of pushback from Labour MPs when she's tried to cut things like, for example, the welfare budget, which they then had to totally reverse on because of the level of anger that there was in the parliamentary party, and because she set her own rules about borrowing. Tax is the one area that, if there is going to be a black hole in the public finances, she's going to have to look at to fill. So we're going to see heaps and heaps of this in the next few months. And some of it might have come a little bit from around government, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen.
No, indeed. And it's interesting because, as you say, Alex, we're very much on a revenue-raising bent at the moment. And that's no secret, right, because of the way the public finances are shaping up. But there's quite...
Basically because you can't borrow anymore,
because
and the government's finding it very hard to cut anything.
If you're not going to change the rules, and if you don't want to cut back on spending, this is your other option, right? And what, as Alex was saying there, you've got kite flying, you've got pitch rolling as well, haven't you? That idea that you're sort of putting ideas out there to sort of prepare the way.
So you're flying a kite on a pitch.
It's incredibly complicated.
People would just stick to one metaphor.
I know. It's not on, is it?
Anyway.
And then you've got your black holes as well. But ultimately, and I used to work in government at one stage in my career, these kind of ideas are being examined all the time by economists up and down in different departments. They'll be looking at, what if you do this? What if you do that? Doesn't mean it's going to happen. Sometimes it's because an idea has been put on your in tray and said, right, can you have a look at this? Sometimes it's just because we haven't looked at this in a while. Can you go and take a look at this? So sometimes the things we hear about aren't going to become a reality at all, but it doesn't mean they're not being looked at.
Yeah, and as we know from various people's memoirs and interviews people have done to like historical backwards-looking podcasts, there's a sort of pile of ideas in the Treasury that get floated up and to the Chancellor's advisors, and the smart ones see the ones that will cause them loads of trouble and then boot them out the pile, but then the same ideas keep recurring.
Well, just on that point, the one that's quite famed for having done that was the winter fuel payment. That was an idea that we know was kicking around the Treasury and was put forward again and again and again and again, and it never happened. And this was obviously in limiting who got the winter fuel payment until the government decided to do it and then reversed on it last year.
And Dharshini, we were just talking there with Alex about, the only forecast that matters is the OBR. Actually, there's plenty of people say maybe that shouldn't be the forecast that matters.
Yeah,
that
totally.
it's a kind of barmy way of managing the public finances.
It is, and if you look at the rules as well, them in themselves, are they the way to manage the public finances? Can you meet a certain point in the future, which actually realistically the public finances are going to look very different when you get to that point, and we're all sort of buying into this. Is this really the way we should be setting the rules that dictate how our public services are funded, how we're investing in the infrastructure which keeps our economy going? Maybe there's another way to do this. And let's not forget, everybody's economists, everybody's forecasts rather, are frankly, can be vulnerable because there is no forecast. They're all built on assumptions. Your assumptions can be wrong. Sometimes they are utterly wrong, quite frankly, and sometimes not because these are people who can't forecast, but because we get wrong footage. Who saw a pandemic coming, for example?
Now, Alex, just on a different note, and I don't want to engage in yet another day of speculation about what will happen in Alaska when Presidents Trump and Putin meet for their Crunch Summit, to quote every news program this week. But President Zelensky of Ukraine has been in Downing Street today. He's been over at Westminster, under at Westminster, up at Westminster.
In Westminster.
In Westminster.
Yeah.
Save ourselves some time.
As was I, in Westminster, in Downing Street, when he turned up this morning to meet with Keir Starmer. And, it was just interesting because they literally in the true sense of the use of that word, rolled out the red carpet for President Zelensky, and the cameras were all there to capture the moment. And Keir Starmer came out, and there was quite a long hug between President Zelensky and Keir Starmer. And then they went in and they had a cuppa in the Rose Garden of Downing Street. They spoke for about an hour. And then they issued the kind of official readout, the sort of script that Downing Street puts out, giving you a sense of what was discussed. And, they said, again, reiterated their unity, but made this point that they thought there was a viable chance to make progress at this summit, added the caveat, as long as Putin takes action to prove he's serious about peace. So I don't think it's been any shift in position. What this was a very deliberate, very visible display of the kind of support from the UK to Ukraine, echoing what we've already discussed, which is how those European leaders are trying to shore up Ukraine's position and leave their words ringing in the ears of President Trump before he goes off to the summit with President Putin.
We will see, and we will be recording episodes of Newscast. We'll sort of do a preview of it on Friday, I think, and then I think the plan is a bunch of us will come in very early on Saturday morning to record an episode that is more conducive to the Alaskan time zone, but less conducive to ours. Oh, one other thing, Alex, yesterday we were talking about Tom Skinner. So the guy who was on The Apprentice, big social media influencer. And we were talking about the fact that he'd been at this barbecue with JD Vance, the US Vice President. News now comes to us. He's going to be on Strictly.
I mean, he's had quite a week. He's had quite the week, hasn't he? Like a barbecue with JD Vance in the Cotswolds, and then he bags a spot on Strictly Come Dancing. If you didn't know who Thomas Skinner was before now, I reckon you're going to know pretty soon.
And it'll be interesting how the Strictly bosses handle that, because I'm assuming they booked him when he was a person on social media who was interesting and had been on The Apprentice and occasionally remarked on the state of Britain. But in the meantime, I mean, I have no idea when they booked him, but in the meantime, he's become much more of a political figure.
Well, he has, because, he's out hanging out with the vice president of the US. And I still don't, we did discuss like who has organised JD Vance's trips and whether George Osborne had a part to play in it. I still don't know how that came about. I mean, it would be interesting to know how Thomas Skinner winded up at that barbecue. I mean, I've got no insight or idea to offer, but he put on social media today he's taking every opportunity that he can while he can. And I mean, a couple of quite big opportunities have clearly come his way recently.
Now, Tom Skinner is not technically a politician, but 5 people who have been technically politicians have been on Strictly in the past. Collectively, can we name all 5?
Anne Widdecombe.
Yeah, easy.
First off.
Low-hanging fruit.
Airballs.
Obviously, yeah.
Michael Portillo?
No.
I made that one up?
Made that up.
Oh, crikey, this is really hard.
Is
it the time to confess that I don't really watch Strictly?
That's fine.
Who else? Give me a party.
Liberal Democrats.
Ooh, what Lib Dem has been on?
Vince Cable.
Vince Cable wasn't on Strictly.
Yes, and he is actually into ballroom dancing, isn't he?
He was on a Christmas special.
Yeah.
Do you know, I should actually know that because he was on Any Questions recently and I read that about him in advance. How terrible. I'm so sorry, Vince Cable. I'm so sorry.
And then we've got two women, one Labour, one Conservative.
Oh, Edwina Curry.
Edwina Curry, of
Correct,
course she was. Well done, Dharshini.
And the final one is a
Labour, this
Labour
must
woman
be.
who is back in government, but
Jackie
from
Smith.
the Lords. Correct.
Oh, thank goodness we got them.
We got there in the
with
end.
a bit of
We
prompting.
got that.
I'd love to say 7, but there were only 5 of them.
Give it time.
Very good.
Dharshini, just to check, this is just me doing my due diligence. You're not going to be on Strictly.
Nobody's asked me yet, but
Okay.
then hang on. When was Tom Skinner asked? There's still a chance, right?
True. And Alex, you're not going to be on Strictly?
No, not yet.
Okay.
And you, Adam?
I'm definitely not. And I've still got friends who this year are convinced that I'm going to be on it. And I've just not
Really?
told them. I keep saying to them, I'm not going to be on Strictly. And now, hopefully, when they hear this in the recorded medium of a podcast on the record, they will believe me.
Maybe
I'm
next year.
not.
We'll hold you to that.
And this is not a false flag, Russian-style false flag, where actually, I actually am.
Okay,
I'm
we
not
believe
rolling
you.
a
Special,
pitch or,
come on.
or digging the hole or whatever
Flying
it
a
is, or
flag.
decided flying the kite.
Flying a kite.
Right, Dharshini, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Alex, thanks to you too.
Pleasure as ever.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We have rolled the pitch, we have flown the last kite, and we've filled the last hole. And we'll be filling more holes, flying more kites, and rolling more pitches in the next episode very soon. Goodbye.